20% of all the oil on Earth moves through a single strip of water just 21 miles wide. That is it, one narrow lane. And as of today, April 12, 2026, the United States Navy just slammed the door on it. This morning, President Trump posted on Truth Social that the U.S. Navy will begin blockading any and all ships trying to enter or leave the Strait of Hormuz. Effective immediately. No warning, no grace period. Done. And here is the thing that makes this moment so extraordinary. Iran already had this strait locked down. Iran was the one blocking the world's oil. Iran was charging ships up to $2 million just to pass through. So the U.S. just walked up to Iran's own roadblock, flipped it around and said, "No, actually nobody gets through now, including you." This is the biggest naval move by the United States in decades, and it did not happen in a vacuum. It happened after 21 straight hours of peace talks in Islamabad, Pakistan completely fell apart. Vice President J.D. Vance flew halfway around the world, sat across from Iranian negotiators for nearly a full day, and walked away with nothing. Nothing, that is, except a very clear picture of exactly why Iran refuses to make a deal. We are going to break all of this down, step by step. The mines nobody can find, the toll booth Iran set up in international waters, the hardware the U.S. Navy is sailing in right now, the economic catastrophe already rippling through gas stations and grocery stores worldwide. And the one question nobody has a clean answer to: what does Iran actually do next? Because right now, both sides are pointing weapons at each other in the most important waterway on the planet, and one wrong move by anyone could change everything. Iran's toll booth at the end of the world. To really understand what is happening right now, you need to know what the Strait of Hormuz actually is, because it is not just a stretch of water. It is the economic heartbeat of the entire planet. On one side, you have Iran. On the other side, Oman. In between, a channel so narrow that if you dropped it on top of Manhattan, it would barely reach from one end of the island to the other. And through that channel, every single day, about 20 million barrels of crude oil flow out of the Persian Gulf to the rest of the world. Saudi Arabia's oil goes through there, Iraq's oil, Kuwait's oil, Qatar's massive supply of liquefied natural gas. If the strait closes, China loses a huge portion of its energy supply. Japan and South Korea go into crisis mode. Europe, already running on nearly empty gas reserves after a rough winter, starts counting days. The IEA described what is happening right now as the equivalent of the two major oil shocks of the 1970s and the European gas crisis of 2022, all hitting at once. To put the scale of this in terms that feel real, the Gulf region behind that strait is home to the oil fields of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, Qatar, and the UAE. These countries collectively pump roughly 20 million barrels of oil every single day just for export. That is not their domestic use. That is just what they sell to the rest of the world. And almost all of it exits through the strait. There is no other practical route. The Saudi East-West pipeline can carry about 7 million barrels a day to the Red Sea, but it was built in the 1980s and has not been significantly upgraded since. Everything else has to go through that 21-mile gap between Iran and Oman. Japan imports about 90% of its oil from the Gulf. South Korea is not far behind. China gets a massive portion of its energy needs from that region. India too. And while the U.S. is actually in a much better position because it is the world's biggest oil producer and LNG exporter, American consumers still feel this through global price signals, through what gets charged at gas stations, through the cost of plastic and diesel and aviation fuel and fertilizer. Everything that gets made, grown, shipped, or flown has oil somewhere in its story. So when the U.S. and Israel launched airstrikes on Iran on February 28, 2026, and Iran's leadership started falling, Tehran played the one card it had left. It closed the strait. Iranian Revolutionary Guard commanders went on the radio and told every ship in the region, "If you try to pass, we will set you on fire." And they meant it. They attacked at least 21 merchant ships. They killed crew members. They sent the message loud and clear. Shipping companies pulled out almost overnight. Insurance rates for anything trying to cross became impossibly expensive. Oil prices shot past $120 a barrel. Countries started hoarding fuel. The Philippines declared a national emergency. Bangladesh, Nigeria, Vietnam, Zimbabwe, all of them scrambling. By mid-March, 230 fully loaded oil tankers were just sitting idle, anchored on both sides of the strait, full of oil that could not go anywhere. But Iran did not just close the strait, it set up a checkpoint. It opened a new shipping lane that runs right along its own coastline, up near Larak Island, where Iran's military could keep eyes on every single vessel passing through. And it started charging. Up to $2 million per ship, collected in Chinese yuan through the Revolutionary Guard. China's tankers paid. India's tankers paid. A handful of others paid. Everyone else sat and waited. That is the situation Trump woke up to this morning. Iran had turned the world's most important waterway into its own personal toll road. And now the U.S. just blockaded the whole thing, toll booth included. 21 hours in Islamabad, and then nothing. Here is what made today's announcement feel like a gut punch. For a brief moment this weekend, it actually looked like a deal might happen. Pakistan hosted the talks. Prime Minister Shahbaz Sharif and Army Chief Field Marshal Asim Munir brought both sides to the table in Islamabad. This was not a small thing. Pakistan has historically tried to stay out of U.S.-Iran disputes, but its geography, its economy, and its military leadership made it a natural neutral ground. Field Marshal Munir, who Trump publicly praised by name, reportedly played a genuinely skilled role keeping the conversation going through the tense overnight hours. Getting Iran and the U.S. in the same room at all, talking face-to-face, is something that almost did not happen. For a stretch of time this weekend, it felt like maybe, just maybe, there was a path forward. The U.S. delegation was led by Vice President Vance, with Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner alongside him. Iran's team showed up too, and they all sat in a room together for more than 21 hours straight, which is not nothing. You do not stay at a table for 21 hours unless at least part of the conversation is going somewhere. And according to Trump's own account, a lot of points were actually agreed to. Smaller issues, procedural things, even some sanctions language reportedly came together. Multiple sources described the atmosphere as very friendly. Negotiators on both sides became personally respectful of each other over those long hours. That is real progress. That is how diplomacy is supposed to work. But then they hit the wall. Iran will not give up its nuclear ambitions. Full stop. No wiggle room. Non-negotiable. Vance stepped out and said it clearly. The bad news is that we have not reached an agreement. I think that is bad news for Iran much more than it is bad news for the United States. He added that the U.S. still needed Iran to commit to not pursuing a nuclear weapon, and they had not seen that commitment yet. Iran's side blamed the collapse on what they called excessive U.S. demands. Iranian state media said the U.S. flew halfway around the world and built no trust. Parliamentary officials mocked the American team. But the core reality, as multiple sources confirmed, is that Iran also refused to give up control of the Strait of Hormuz. They wanted to keep charging tolls. They wanted war reparations. They wanted the ceasefire extended across Lebanon, where Israel was still striking Hezbollah. They wanted their frozen assets released. And on top of all of that, they wanted to keep their enriched uranium stockpile. That is not a negotiating position. That is a wish list from a country whose Air Force, Navy, and much of its leadership have already been destroyed. And Trump, for his part, was not interested in pretending otherwise. Within hours of Vance's announcement, Trump posted the blockade order. The decision had reportedly been sitting in a drawer as a backup plan for days, waiting to see if Islamabad produced anything. It did not. So here we are. The mine problem nobody saw coming. Now here is the part of this story that should genuinely alarm you, because it is alarming even to the people who are supposed to be in charge of fixing it. When Iran closed the strait back in early March, it did not just rely on warships and threats. It also laid sea mines. Real naval mines, dropped into the water by small boats operating in decentralized units without much coordination or record-keeping. The U.S. has confirmed at least a dozen Iranian-made mines in the strait, specifically the Maham 3 and Maham 7 limpet varieties, which are triggered by pressure, sound, or magnetic signatures and can sit quietly on the ocean floor waiting for a ship to drift within range. Here is the terrifying part. Iran lost track of them. According to reporting by the New York Times, citing U.S. officials, Iran cannot locate all of the mines it deployed. The operation to drop them was rushed, scattered, and poorly documented. The small boats used to place them were likely the same type of vessels that are nearly impossible to track from the air, and sea currents in the strait can shift mines from where they were originally placed, turning the whole waterway into a minefield that even the people who built it cannot map. Think about what that actually means for a ship captain trying to navigate the strait right now. You are steering a vessel the length of 3 football fields through a channel barely 21 miles across at its narrowest point. You have 2 lanes, each a few miles wide, and somewhere in those lanes, there are mines on the ocean floor. Nobody knows exactly how many. Nobody knows exactly where they all are. Not the U.S. with its satellites and sonar arrays, and not even the country that put them there. The mine could be right where the charts say the safe channel is. It could have drifted half a mile from its original spot. You will not know until your hull hits it. A limpet mine does not look like what you see in old war movies with the spiky ball floating on the surface. Modern versions sit at depth and activate when they sense the right combination of pressure, magnetic signature, and sound that matches a large vessel passing overhead. One strike on a very large crude carrier loaded with 2 million barrels of oil is not just a maritime incident. It is an environmental catastrophe and a fireball visible for miles. No sane insurance underwriter is going to cover that risk until someone credibly clears the water. And that is exactly the problem. That means when Iran told the world during the ceasefire that it would open the strait, it physically could not make that guarantee with a straight face. Any ship owner hearing, "We think it might be safe," is going to weigh that against a $2 million hull loss and several dead crew members, and decide to keep sitting at anchor, thank you very much. Mine clearance is one of the most difficult and time-consuming operations in all of naval warfare. Even with the best equipment in the world, clearing a body of water the size of the Strait of Hormuz is not a weekend project. The U.S. Navy has MH-53E Sea Dragon helicopters that can tow magnetic and mechanical sweeping gear across the surface. P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft scanning from above with advanced sonar and radar systems. Underwater drones running grid patterns below the surface. And still, experts say you cannot rush this. You sweep, you scan, you verify, you sweep again. The 2 U.S. Navy destroyers that entered the strait on Saturday, the USS Frank E. Peterson, Jr. and the USS Michael Murphy, both Arleigh Burke-class guided missile ships, went in as part of mine-clearing operations. Iran called it a ceasefire violation. The U.S. called it a freedom of navigation operation. Both things can be true simultaneously, which is what makes this moment so dangerous. What Iran created as a weapon to close the strait has now become a weapon that keeps even Iran from fully controlling the situation. And that paradox is sitting right in the middle of the most important 21 miles of ocean on Earth. What the U.S. Navy is actually doing right now. Let's talk hardware, because the equipment moving into the Strait of Hormuz right now is some of the most capable military technology ever put to sea, and understanding what it can do tells you a lot about how serious this situation is. The Arleigh Burke-class destroyers are the workhorses of the U.S. surface fleet. Each one displaces over 9,000 tons of water, runs longer than 5 football fields, and can sprint at more than 30 knots, thanks to gas turbine engines. Each ship carries 96 vertical launch system cells, which means 96 missiles that can be fired at targets in the air, on the surface, or on land, depending on what is loaded. They also carry a 5-inch deck gun, a close-in weapons system that shreds incoming missiles and drones with thousands of rounds per minute, and torpedoes for anything underwater. But the real muscle is the Aegis combat system. Think of Aegis as the nervous system of the entire operation. It pulls in radar data from the ship itself, from nearby aircraft, from other ships, and ties it all together into one shared picture. If a drone breaks through one ship's defenses and heads for another, Aegis has already told the second ship it is coming. If an aircraft from hundreds of miles away spots a threat, Aegis routes that information to every ship in the battle group in real time. In a strait where Iran still has hundreds of small fast boats, drones, and the willingness to use them, Aegis is what separates a clean operation from a catastrophe. Supporting from the air, you have MH-53E Sea Dragon helicopters doing mine-clearing passes. These are big, heavy-lift aircraft that can drag acoustic and magnetic sweeping systems through the water on long cables below the helicopter. The idea is to create the same kind of pressure signature a large ship would make, which tricks a pressure-triggered mine into detonating while the helicopter is safely up in the air. It is one of the few ways to clear a minefield without putting a ship or a diver directly at risk. Then there is the P-8 Poseidon, which is essentially a Boeing 737 that has been converted into a flying sensor platform. It carries advanced radar, acoustic buoys it drops into the water to listen for submarine and mine signatures, and the ability to engage threats directly with torpedoes and missiles. In terms of covering large areas quickly and building a picture of what is in the water, the P-8 is the aircraft you want overhead. It can stay on station for hours, cover hundreds of miles of ocean, and relay everything it finds back to the ships below in real time. Trump confirmed that the UK and other countries are sending minesweepers to join the effort, building out what is shaping up to be a multinational naval presence in the Strait. The UK confirmed it is working to assemble a wide coalition to support the operation. That is significant because it means this is not just a US unilateral move. It has the shape of an international freedom of navigation mission, which gives it more political cover and more operational resources. Iran's Revolutionary Guard has responded by saying the strait is open to civilian ships, but that military vessels will be dealt with severely. That is a threat, and it is not an empty one. Iran still has hundreds of small fast boats. It still has shore-based anti-ship missile batteries. It still has drones. Its naval commander was killed in an airstrike in March, but the institutions survived. And a cornered, weakened opponent with nothing left to lose is not necessarily a predictable one. Trump's message on that front was simple. Any Iranian who fires at us, or at peaceful vessels, will be blown to hell. So that is where we are. Two heavily armed sides, in a very small stretch of water, daring each other to blink. The world is already paying the price. While the military side of this plays out on the water, the consequences for ordinary people everywhere have been stacking up for weeks, and they are only going to get heavier now. Brent crude oil hit over $120 a barrel when the strait first closed. It came back down a bit, hovering around $103 as of Friday, but analysts are openly talking about the possibility of $170 or even $200 per barrel if this drags on. To put that in plain terms, gas prices in the U.S. already jumped about 30%. Diesel, which is what trucks run on, which is what moves literally everything you buy in a store, shot up even more. But it is not just fuel. A third of the world's fertilizer trade goes through the Strait of Hormuz. Farmers planting spring crops right now are paying significantly more for inputs. Food prices in Gulf countries exploded, with some staples jumping 40 to 120%. Countries like Iraq and Kuwait depend on the strait for over 80% of their caloric intake, not just their energy. The IEA emergency released 400 million barrels of oil from strategic reserves worldwide, which sounds like a lot until you do the math. Global daily consumption is over 105 million barrels, so that reserve covers about 4 days. Europe is in a particularly bad spot. Gas storage going into this winter was already near historic lows after a brutal 2025 season. With Qatari LNG now stranded and no easy alternative route for that gas, European prices nearly doubled. The European Central Bank postponed planned interest rate cuts. Economists are raising the word recession in countries that cannot easily swap out their energy sources. For China and India, the nations that have been paying Iran's toll and getting their oil through the special corridor near Larak Island, the U.S. blockade is a direct economic threat. Trump made that crystal clear, saying any country that helps Iran by paying the toll could face a 50% tariff. That is a message aimed squarely at Beijing, which has been one of the few buyers keeping Iran economically viable during this crisis. For China and India, the nations that have been paying Iran's toll and getting their oil through the special corridor near Larak Island, the U.S. blockade is a direct economic threat. Trump made that crystal clear, saying any country that helps Iran by paying the toll could face a 50% tariff. That is a message aimed squarely at Beijing, which has been one of the few buyers keeping Iran economically viable during this crisis. There is also a food angle that almost nobody is talking about. About a third of the world's fertilizer trade moves through the Strait of Hormuz. That includes ammonia and other key inputs that farmers need for spring planting right now, in April, across Asia and parts of Europe. If those fertilizer shipments stay stuck, the food price spike that started with fuel prices gets worse through the summer and into harvest season. The IEA noted this early on. The UN actually negotiated a specific humanitarian exception to let fertilizer ships through back in March, but that arrangement is now in question with a full U.S. blockade in place. The ripple effects from this waterway go much farther than most people realize. The blockade does not just pressure Iran, it pressures everyone who was doing business with Iran while the rest of the world was locked out. That is the strategic logic behind it. If you cut off Iran's last remaining revenue stream, the oil it was selling through its checkpoint, the regime loses its ability to fund itself, fund its proxies, and fund any remaining resistance. At the same time, you flip the power dynamic in the strait. Instead of Iran controlling who gets through, the U.S. controls who gets through. That is a very different world. Whether that economic pressure is enough to bring Iran back to the table, or whether it pushes an already desperate regime towards something more dangerous, is the question nobody has answered yet. What happens next? The China angle is particularly worth watching. Beijing has been one of the few countries keeping Iran's economy breathing during this crisis, buying oil through Iran's Strait checkpoint and paying the tolls in Chinese yuan. Trump's threat of a 50% tariff on any country assisting Iran is aimed directly at that relationship. China buys roughly 10% of its oil from Iran under normal circumstances. Right now, with Gulf oil stuck behind the blockade, Iran has been one of the few sources still delivering. Cutting that off puts Beijing in a very uncomfortable position. Side with Iran and face massive U.S. tariffs on top of the ones already in place, or step back and watch a client state get strangled economically. India faces a similar calculation. Indian tankers were among those paying to pass through Iran's corridor. Indian naval escorts helped move LPG carriers out of the strait in March. India has been trying to stay neutral, maintaining energy ties with Iran while keeping its strategic partnership with the U.S. intact. A U.S. blockade forces a choice neither side wants to make explicitly. And then there is the nuclear question, which is really the whole reason any of this is happening. Iran's refusal to give up its nuclear enrichment stockpile is the immovable object at the center of all these negotiations. The U.S. position is simple. Iran will never be allowed to have a nuclear weapon, full stop. Iran's position is equally simple in its own way. It will not surrender the one thing it believes protects it from regime change. These two positions are not compatible. Every other point in the negotiations, the sanctions relief, the reparations, the strait access, all of it is background noise until that core disagreement gets resolved. And right now, it is not resolved. The blockade is Trump's way of making the cost of that impasse clear. Every day the strait stays locked down, Iran loses more of its remaining oil revenue. Every day the mines stay in the water, Iran's international reputation takes another hit. Every day the U.S. Navy sits in the strait, Iran's claim to control that waterway gets weaker. The pressure is designed to be cumulative, and the question is whether it breaks the logjam on the nuclear issue before it breaks the ceasefire entirely. Here is where we land, and there is no clean ending to this story because the story is not over. The ceasefire that was agreed to 2 weeks ago is now in serious jeopardy. Pakistan's foreign minister called it imperative to preserve. Israel is still striking Hezbollah in Lebanon. Iran is making threats about U.S. warships, and the U.S. Navy is sailing into one of the most tense patches of ocean in the world to clear mines that the people who planted them cannot fully locate. Analysts are warning that Iran could view a naval blockade as an act of war. That is a reasonable concern. At the same time, Iran's military capacity has been dramatically reduced. Its air force is gone. Its navy has been decimated. Most of its top military commanders are dead. What it has left are fast boats, drones, shore-based missiles, and the willingness to cause chaos even without the ability to win a conventional fight. Vance said diplomacy is not finished. He left the door open when he walked out of Islamabad, saying a simple proposal was on the table, and Iran could accept it if they chose. Trump echoed that Iran would eventually come back to negotiations. But Trump also said the U.S. military is fully locked and loaded, and ready to finish up the little that is left of Iran at an appropriate moment. The blockade is a pressure tool. It is designed to squeeze Iran economically while demonstrating that the U.S., not the IRGC, controls the Strait of Hormuz. The historical parallel Trump's team seems to be reaching for is Venezuela, where sustained economic and naval pressure eventually crumbled the Maduro government's grip. Whether that parallel holds for Iran, a country with a far more entrenched military culture and deeper ideological roots, is genuinely unknown. What is known is this: the world's most important waterway is now being blockaded by the world's most powerful navy. Mines are sitting on the ocean floor whose exact locations nobody fully knows. Oil prices are high and rising. Hundreds of tankers are still waiting to move. A fragile ceasefire is hanging by a thread. And Iran's last real bargaining chip, the threat of closing the strait, just got called by an opponent willing to close it themselves. The next 48 to 72 hours matter enormously. Every ship movement, every Iranian statement, every U.S. Navy transit will be watched by every government and every energy market on the planet. This is not the kind of situation where the world gets to look away. If this video helped you make sense of what is happening, hit like and subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. Because this situation is moving fast. Turn on notifications so you are not catching up to 3-day-old news. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think the U.S. blockade brings Iran back to the table? Or does it push this towards something worse? Drop your take in the comments below.